Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard podcast. I know it's been a minute, but I'm ready to hit the ground running this season. And at the end of last year, I mentioned I plan to move to like a less frequent slash scheduled upload schedule. And that's absolutely still the plan. But at least to start the year out, I want to do something more frequent. I'm planning on previewing 30 teams in 30 days here, releasing one of these each day, kind of leading up to the NBA regular season, just to kind of get my sea legs back under me as far as recording goes. And then also just kind of whet everyone's appetite for what is shaping up to be a really exciting and compelling NBA season. The plan is to maybe spend 5 or 10 minutes discussing the prior season for each team, any changes they made over the offseason, whether I like the general direction of the team and just trying to predict their ultimate success. Are they going to hit their over under for wins? Are they going to be a legitimate title contender, or are they entering the Wembanyama sweepstakes? And I thought there's really no better way to kick this thing off than with the defending champion Golden State Warriors. And last season's Warrior group was just as feel good of a story as we've had in the league in a very long time. Klay Thompson comes back after missing what, like 2.5 years of basketball. Curry breaks the all time 3-point record. Andrew Wiggins finally taps into some of that potential that we all saw for him when he was drafted. As an NBA fan, it was just good to have the Warriors back. They play a really exciting, team oriented brand of basketball, and things are just much more fun with them in the mix. And I felt like for most fans in the league, unless you're just a staunch Steph hater or a Warriors hater, if your team wasn't going to take home the title, then you could still find something to be happy about with the results of last season. And looking back, it was actually more of a roller coaster type season for the Warriors, at least more so than what I think it will be remembered as. Early on in the year, they pretty much looked unbeatable. Steph was at the front of the race for MVP. Jordan Poole broke out onto the scene as this future all-star type player. Klay Thompson, that return date was imminent, it was going to be any day. And then Andrew Wiggins even got voted in as an all-star starter. And then things kind of go off the rails a little bit. Steph enters this crazy slump. And if you look back at his numbers for the entire year, it was a really down year for him by his standards, at least. I think most players would be thrilled with those stats. But for him, that was a pretty down year. Wiggins came back down to earth a little bit. Klay, when he did enter the lineup, it was kind of up and down with his play. And then later on in the year, both Steph and Draymond got hurt, kind of entering the playoffs. And the Draymond injury was particularly devastating because it was a back injury, and there were some real question marks as to what version of him was going to return for the playoffs, if any at all. And then James Wiseman gets ruled out for the entire year. So the big man depth for the Warriors was looking pretty bleak there for a while. So entering the playoffs, that health thing was a huge concern. And it was so much of a concern that everybody just kind of wrote them off as title contenders. I mean, sure, there were some people who thought they could, but they were far from the favorite to make it even out of the West to the finals, much less win the title. But they got some breaks. They persevered, and ultimately that championship grit and experience was enough to propel them over the top and hoist the Larry O'Brien trophy. And usually after a finals run like this, the roster just gets totally gutted for for all those role players that kind of helped them along the way. But that really wasn't the case for this Warriors group. They're able to bring back Kevon Looney on an okay deal, I guess. I mean, I'm not jumping up and down about the salary figure that he's getting, but he's been with that organization from the very beginning of his career. So the Warriors have been able to kind of develop him and mold him to fit their very specific needs, setting screens, running handoffs, knowing when and where to cut, all those little things that don't really show up in the box score. And he knows that fairly complicated Warrior system like the back of his hand. So Looney's value to the Warriors is always going to be far greater than his value would be to another team. And if you think about this, if you were like a small business owner and there's this IT guy that knows all of your systems inside and out, you might be willing to overpay him a little bit or give him a generous raise just to keep him there. Because sure, you could go out there and find someone cheaper, but it's going to take time to train that new person. And who is to say that they're ever going to do as good of a job as the guy you had? That's sort of who Looney is for this Warriors team, just the behind the scenes, dirty work guy. And I'm fine with the contract that he got. Outside of that, sure, losing Gary Payton II, that's a pretty significant loss. They also lose Otto Porter, who was important for them, Nemanja Bjelica, Juan Toscano Anderson, and Damon Lee. And then outside of Porter Jr. and Payton, the other guys that I mentioned, your Toscano Andersons, Damon Lees, and Bjelicas, those are really just depth guys. They weren't real rotation pieces for the Warriors, so not a huge loss. And so when you add guys like Dante DiVincenzo and JaMychal Green, not to mention Klay Thompson is going to have a full offseason to get his legs under him. Also, guys like Kuminga and Poole with another year of experience. And they're going to also be adding a former number 2 overall pick and James Wiseman coming back from his injury. Maybe he's really good. Maybe he isn't. Jury's still out on that. But at the worst case scenario with Wiseman, he's going to give them some Draymond and Looney insurance for either foul trouble or injuries. So I think it's very possible to make a case, at least on paper, this year's Warriors team looks even better than the one from last year. So it might seem like a no-brainer to take the over at 51 and a half wins, given that they won 53 last year and had to deal with some injuries. And like I mentioned, some of the upgrades they made on this roster are looking better than the players that they lost in the offseason. So that might seem like a no-brainer, and we should expect to see them back in the finals in June once again. But I would pump the brakes on both of those predictions. With regards to last year's playoff run, I don't want to take anything away from what they did, but they had a really fortuitous path through the playoffs. This is a team that would have really struggled defending a big, athletic, dominant type center, but they never really faced one except for in round one where they played against Jokic, who was out there with a bunch of G League guys. And despite the seeding, despite Denver being a 6th seed, I strongly feel that Denver was the weakest team in the playoffs, be it East or West. If you really look back at the teams that made the playoffs and you're like, who could Denver beat in a series? I don't think there was a team based on what they had injury wise in the playoffs. Round 2, they get Memphis, and Bigs wise, they have Jaren Jackson Jr., who plays exclusively on the perimeter, and then either Steven Adams or Brandon Clark, neither of whom are really hurting you inside. Then rather than play the Suns with DeAndre Ayton because of their meltdown, they play the Mavs, who are rolling with Dwight Powell at center, who for large stretches of the playoffs just looked totally unplayable to me. And then Maxi Kleber, who's just your classic stretch 5. In the finals, it's kind of the same deal. You've got Al Horford and Tice, and sure, Robert Williams can catch some lobs, but he was banged up, and offensively, he's not really much of a threat outside of just catching some lobs. And in no way am I saying that you need to put an asterisk in front of this title. You play the team that's in front of you and they earned it. It's just teams that repeat in the NBA are typically these juggernaut type teams that are dominant for long stretches and are unquestionably the favorites. And I think those days for this Warriors group have passed. Curry had a down year last year. So is that going to be an anomaly, or is that a sign of things to come for him? How is Klay going to be able to hold up in an 82 game season plus playoffs? Same with Draymond. The injuries are really starting to pile up for him. And then also with Draymond, he could be a free agent after next season if he decides to decline that player option for like 27 million. And allegedly he wants a max, and I don't think that they could give that to him in good conscience. So is that going to cause issues if they can't work out an extension? Wiggins, same thing in a contract year. Is he going to overextend himself play wise, trying to prove that he deserves big money? Poole, another guy in a contract year, is he going to be content to continue coming off the bench? Not to mention, the West is just going to be much better this year than it was last year. Both the Clippers and the Nuggets were crossed off last season due to injuries, and both are going to be back at full strength or relative full strength. The Timberwolves, they made a big trade this offseason to improve. The Blazers should be back in the mix. The Pelicans are primed to take a real step up this next season, similar to what we saw the Grizzlies do last season. Then you got teams like the Suns, the Mavericks, the Grizzlies. They aren't going anywhere. Really, the only team that didn't improve out west who made the playoffs from last season is the Utah Jazz. So I just think it's going to be far more competitive out west this year. These are real concerns if you're rooting for this team to repeat this season. But If you're feeling optimistic, the case for them to repeat or kind of maintain that championship level is going to be the young guys on this team. If they're ready to take a huge step forward and are ahead of schedule developmentally, the Warriors are going to have a ton of options. I mentioned Wiseman, and while he hasn't looked great to start his career, I wouldn't completely give up on him yet. He's had one of the roughest starts in terms of like the circumstances surrounding the start to his career of any player I can remember. He entered the league during COVID, having missed pretty much an entire year of basketball due to a suspension in college. He gets no summer league. He gets limited training camp and practices, and then misses last season due to injury. So we really haven't seen him have a chance to really do much or have a lot of practice under his belt. He was that first year, he was just kind of thrust out there, having not played basketball in a year and starting for a team that had some playoff aspirations. That's a tough ask for a young big man. So it's entirely possible that he takes a massive leap ahead this year, showing us why he was taken after Ant-Man and before LaMelo. Then you've got Jonathan Kuminga, another guy who's primed to take a massive leap this season. And while I don't think this will be the year, I could see him following at some point a similar development route as Kawhi Leonard. No, I don't think he's ever going to be as good as a prime Kawhi Leonard. But if you think about early in Kawhi's career, he was super raw, didn't really have an offensive game to speak of, but a championship level organization had him filling very specific roles, more defensive oriented roles, until he was ready to step in and be a primary offensive option. It sounds a lot like the role the Warriors are probably going to have planned for Kuminga. And for him, he was the youngest player in his draft class, and one of the big concerns with him entering was his motor, and that's not been an issue so far. So I expect him to continue to develop and get a lot better. I just see a very special player tucked away in there somewhere. And if he can tap into that this season, as opposed to in 1 or 2 years in the future, look out. The Warriors even have guys like Moses Moody on this roster who showed some flashes, and they drafted Patrick Baldwin Jr., who was a highly rated high school recruit at some point. So even though this core that we all know and love is starting to get on up there in years, if this young group is ready to go ahead of schedule, or the Warriors decide to cash in some of these young guys with that Draymond Green or Wiggins expiring, they could even acquire another star. Even having said that, though, I'm still taking the under. I don't see the Warriors making some big splash for a star. And I think the young guys, like the really young guys, your Kumingas, your Wisemans, guys like that, I still think they're a year away. I just don't see them competing this season for a top seed out west. And that's going to make their journey through the playoffs that much harder. To me, their destiny is likely a victory in the first round, maybe a trip to the conference finals, but that's about it. But regardless, things are set up for this Warriors group to be in the mix for years to come. So don't expect them to go away anytime soon.